right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 7, the Early Republic. So, the Early Republic is the time period in American history that stretches roughly from 1789, which is when the US Constitution is enacted, until 1815, which is the ending of the War of 1812. And this is a time period that covers essentially the first five presidents. Now, last chapter, we covered the presidency of George Washington and John Adams, presidents one and two. In this chapter, we're going to get to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. And a continuing theme in the early republic, and really a continuing theme in broadly all of American history, is putting the ideas that were behind the American Revolution to practice. That the American Revolution and even the election of Thomas Jefferson being the author of the Declaration of Independence and having championed the ideas, behind the revolution, that different groups of Americans would claim the rhetoric of the revolution. So, of the promised freedom and liberty, let's just take note that different groups of Americans we'll say laid claim to the promise of the revolution. And, without a doubt, especially as we progress through the chapters and make our way closer to the American Civil War, certainly one of the most tense, or where we see a lot of this tension is between the notion or idea of freedom and the practice of slavery. That is to say, during the early Republic period, there are plenty of examples of both free and enslaved Black Americans challenging slavery using the rhetoric of the Revolution. One example is Gabriel's rebellion in 1800. Gabriel was an enslaved man, was a planned slave revolt, which was exposed, never actually took place. As a result, Gabriel and 25 others were executed. And from Gabriel's rebellion, even though it failed, and most slave revolts in North America, the English colonies, and after the American Revolution in the United States, most of them do fail. But they do have significant consequences. We'll just make kind of two notes about Gabriel's rebellion here. This proved that enslaved people, and this will be a feature of the United States going forward, could and did plan revolts. Right? Could and did plan revolts. And the second point is that one of the things that enslavers really tried to prevent was the spreading of information regarding slave revolts in other places. And probably the most consequential one is the Haitian Revolution, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But slave revolts in other parts of the world, and even slave revolts in other parts of the country, provide inspiration for enslaved individuals to, rise up and attempt a revolt of their own. So Gabriel's rebellion also proved the failure to keep the information from those enslaved. All right, from those enslaved. Now, where a slave revolt was successful, though, was in Haiti, which was a French sugar colony. And the Haitian Revolution was in part inspired by the French Revolution. In fact, during one of the more radical phases of the French Revolution, the French had gone and abolished slavery. When Napoleon came back in power, he attempted to put slavery back in place. But by that point, those who were enslaved on the island of Haiti had rose up and successfully not just achieved their freedom, but the Haitian Revolution is very unique in that this is a slave revolt turned independent nation. Right? So you had the essentially a slave revolt turned independence movements, and oftentimes when we talk about the age of revolution, we typically have four revolutions that we put in that in that category: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, because it did result in the creation of an independent nation, and then the various revolutions in Latin America. The Haitian Revolution ended up being, pretty important as far as affecting the colonies. I mean, one was that this proved inspiration to Black Americans, both free and enslaved. And it was fear for white Americans. That is to say that, one of the big impacts that slave revolts have on American society is not necessarily that many of them are successful, in terms of the participants actually achieving their freedom. In fact, many end up like, like Gabriel, caught, captured, executed, something along those lines. But where it really has an impact is that it really does drive fear and anxiety, especially among the slaveholding class. And the Haitian Revolution was exactly that: inspiration for Black Americans, fear for white Americans. Now, there were other people who also, challenged slavery in the United States. A good example, or one of the more outspoken individuals, was David Walker. David Walker, he's a Black abolitionist. He called for resistance. I believe David Walker was a free Black man, I think in Boston, to slavery and racism. And one more thing that we'll say about David Walker is that he praised the Haitian Revolution. An image of the Battle of San Domingo over here on the right-hand side. We also have a quote from John Russwurm, who is also showing praise for the Haitian Revolution. He says, quote, "Haitians have adopted the republican form of government. In no country are the rights and privileges of citizens and foreigners more respected and crimes less frequent." John Russwurm. Now, as far as race was concerned, there was not only a tension, between the principles of the American Revolution, freedom, liberty, equality, and then the practice on slavery on the one hand, but there was also a curiosity and even confusion, about race, and in some cases, contradictory notions of it. The quote unquote great curiosity of the time period, which puzzled scientists and other people who had thought they had race figured out, was the case of Henry Moss. Henry Moss was an enslaved Black man who, in 3 years, his skin turned white. Again, this was the great curiosity of the time. And other ways in which we see some tension with this category of race is with some of the rhetoric with the Enlightenment on the one hand. This does align with some of the other things we said earlier about American principles of freedom, liberty, equality, stuff like that. The Enlightenment was a much broader movement. Remember, this was something that was in Europe, but one thing that the Enlightenment stressed was this notion of a common humanity. And at the same time, while Enlightenment, philosophers were stressing this notion of common humanity, on the other hand, you had, the type of growing science, European anthropology. And what anthropologists did was they began categorizing people by race. And so we'll say about European anthropology, they categorize people by race. And in those days, it was more or less physical characteristics. Right? Physical characteristics. And so there were different categories that were created by anthropologists, and then not just the categorization, but taking it one step further, and that is to divide the races into civilized and primitive. And so you can see, how you could have some tension there, right? This notion of common humanity on the one side, but then saying there are civilized and primitive races on the other. Thomas Jefferson weighed in on the matter, and in his infamous Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson, he had wrote that Native Americans, he believed could be civilized, whereas Black Americans, Jefferson said, could not be civilized. Section 3, Jeffersonian Republicanism. So Thomas Jefferson's presidency represented, in a lot of ways, the quote unquote ordinary citizen. And so we might say that Jefferson tried, not just tried, he did, represented the ordinary citizen. And even Jefferson himself tried to portray himself as a quote unquote ordinary citizen, although Jefferson himself was anything but that. But there were kind of some different ways to interpret Jefferson's victory. This was the common class over the elite class, right? So the elites had lost out. Jefferson represented kind of more the commoners. It was democracy over central power. Remember that the Federalists really wanted to create a more efficient government, and in doing that, that meant centralizing power. Jefferson wanted to spread that out, and we can think of Jefferson's presidency as bottom up, not top down. Right? That this is the way to essentially govern. Now, as far as citizenship is concerned, right? If Jefferson's presidency is supposed to represent the quote unquote ordinary citizen, citizenship was defined in much stricter terms. Now, the US Constitution doesn't provide an exact blueprint for who is considered a citizen and who isn't, but state laws and culture more or less can define citizenship. And for the most part, citizenship was coded in masculine, that is male, white, and wealthy. And one way that we can trace this, or one way that we might trace this, is in something like voting laws. Voting laws depended on a state-by-state basis, so depending on what state one was in, it might differ. But for the most part, in order to vote, at least in this early period, had to be male, white, or a free white persons, and then you had to own property. Now, one thing that is beginning to change, it's not quite here in the Jeffersonian era, but one impact that Jefferson's presidency has, or people are bringing more attention to this point down here. Should citizenship be defined by property? It was believed by the founders that if you're going to vote and participate in the government, you should have some skin in the game, so to speak. And so men who had property, they had something to lose, and so therefore they're incentivized in some ways to maybe think more carefully about the types of governments, laws, and policies that they enact. But one of the pushes, and again we see this bottom up, democracy over centralized power, commoner over the elites. This question about property as being a requirement for voting, this is going to be further challenged. Um, In regards to the role that women had in politics, I know we mentioned this, either in an earlier chapter, I believe, but it's mentioned once again here in chapter 7, and that is this notion of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood, we'll call this the civic duty of women to raise and educate the next, say, generation of Americans. And that's, at the time, that was the legal and socially and culturally acceptable way for women to contribute to their country, to have children, teach them about the principles of liberty, freedom, equality, et cetera, et cetera. That is to say, no direct, we'll say, participation. What we mean by that is, things like voting and holding office. That was not in the realm of civic duty for women at this time. Now, as far as Jefferson's presidency is concerned, recall that we had used this term earlier, the quote unquote revolution of 1800. And Jefferson's presidency had marked the ending of what was at the time about 25 years of more power being centralized in fewer hands, right? If we think about the way that the Continental Congress conducted the Revolutionary War, to the Confederation period, to the Constitution, which, the purpose of the Constitution was to create a stronger, more central government. Alexander Hamilton's economic policies. So on the scale, we mentioned it earlier. You have democracy on the one hand. You have tyranny, although Federalists probably wouldn't call it tyranny. They might call it something like a strong government. You might call this a weak government. Jefferson's presidency is a clear move. Is a clear move back into this direction, right? And pretty much the American project up until this point, think about it, we started with 13 colonies and then we got to one single country. So we've been slowly moving towards a stronger, more efficient government. In Jefferson's eyes, he would say that's a bad thing. And so Jefferson's presidency, the first time really since ever, we're moving back towards this more democratic government, more free government, in Jefferson's words. Critics would say a weaker government and less effective. So what does Jefferson do? Well, Jefferson's policies is to reverse all the Federalist policies. He wants to get rid of pretty much everything that has been enacted. So that means to remove all internal taxes. Remember, Alexander Hamilton, the leading Federalist, had worked very hard to get excise taxes passed in order to resolve the financial situation. Thomas Jefferson removes that. Also, what Jefferson does is reduce the budget. He doesn't want the government to be as active economically, and even goes so far as to reduce the military, which is interesting. And according to Jefferson, he would say that a strong military is more of a threat to their own citizens than perhaps useful in combating or fighting, fighting other people. Again, recall that Jefferson is a Republican. Whereas before, during John Adams, you had this quasi-war breakout with France. Because Jefferson's a Republican, they want the French side to win in the war that's going on in Europe. So when Jefferson gets elected, this is better relations with France. In fact, the quasi-war comes to an end, and now the relationship between France and the United States is going to improve after Thomas Jefferson, and the relationship between Britain and the United States is going to get worse. And this may be the most clear in the case of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which is considered to be perhaps Jefferson's greatest accomplishment as president. So we'll say Jefferson's greatest accomplishment And the Louisiana Purchase, this was land bought from France and doubled size of the U.S. Right, and even for Thomas Jefferson, someone who would probably have been critical of something like the Louisiana Purchase had it been enacted or done by a Federalist president, but even the Federalists couldn't really argue with Jefferson's decision here. And one of the consequences from that is that, well, the French had decided to sell this land or territory to the US because they had lost their sugar colony of Haiti. Haiti had successfully revolted, and the French needed money to fight the British. And so the fact that the United States was giving money to the French could use that money for war against Britain. And so one of the consequences here is that US British relations suffered. And in fact, from this point forward, we're going to see how US British relations end up going essentially down the toilet. They got there pretty quickly. And that's because under Jefferson's presidency, in I believe this was 1807, I want to say was the Chesapeake, 1807. Recall that we had talked earlier about the British practice of impressment. And impressment was the practice of kidnapping US sailors and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. The British continued to do that. In one particular instance, impressment went wrong. And in 1807, a number of Americans were killed by the British in a failed sort of impressment. So we'll just say of the US Chesapeake in 1807, we'll say was attacked by the British, Americans killed. And Thomas Jefferson is, there are people who want blood. I mean, they killed us. We need to go kill them. We need to declare war. We need to do something. But Thomas Jefferson is keeping in mind what Washington had said, and that was, Washington had made a point to ensure that the United States remained neutral in the war. And so Jefferson's response is not a revenge attack or response militarily, but instead Jefferson responds by issuing an embargo, the Embargo Act. And this is Jefferson's response to the Chesapeake incident. And it cuts off trade with Britain. And, if we think about the history of the United States and the role that things like boycotting played, boycotting had been largely successful during the colonial era, roughly speaking. And so to once again boycott British goods as a form of punishment, or not even just boycott, but refuse to trade, seemed like a reasonable idea. But the Embargo Act really wasn't, didn't really work out all that well. The American economy suffered as a consequence. And, if you're to look at Jefferson's presidency and say, where did he really sort of drop the ball, or what was not a very effective policy, a lot of people will point to the Embargo Act as being, it didn't really, help relations with the British. It hurt American commerce. It ended up being removed by his successor. It didn't really accomplish exactly what Jefferson wanted. But the Federalists were on the attack, and any opportunity that they could criticize Thomas Jefferson, they took that opportunity. And in addition to maybe his failed Embargo Act, another way that Federalists attacked Thomas Jefferson was his relationship with Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was enslaved by Jefferson, who he had sexual relations and children with. Now, this was rumored for a long time because back then they didn't have DNA or paternity tests or anything like that, but it even called, or it even, this relationship even was inspiration for Federalist critics. Here we have, James Callender, who called Thomas Jefferson, quote, our little mulatto president. Mulatto is a word for mixed race, white and black. This was rumored for a long time. In fact, probably just up until maybe the past 25 years or so. It was proven by DNA. And in total, Jefferson is believed to have had 6 children with Sally Hemings. Some of those descendants are still alive today. Rumors were put to rest when DNA did in fact confirm it. Now, despite the fact that the Federalists might want to, criticize Jefferson at every opportunity, it turned out that his presidency was rather successful. In fact, not only his presidency, but the Democratic Republican Party, more broadly speaking. And so when Thomas Jefferson takes power in 1800, he's a Republican. In 1804, he wins again. His successor in 1808 is James Madison, right, who had been his, I think after 1804 had been his vice president. James Madison was somewhat of a protege, also from Virginia, part of the same political party. This was passed on to 1812, where James Madison won re-election. In 1816, James Monroe, another person from Virginia, another Republican, another one of Jefferson's gang, you could essentially say. And James Monroe won the election in 1816, and he won the election in 1820. So what does this all give us? Well, this gives us 25 years of Republican rule. All right, 25 years of Republican rule. And so Jefferson's presidency essentially kicked that off. And sometimes we refer to this as the Virginia dynasty, because essentially what you have are all these people, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, 25 years of the presidency, all from Virginia, all from Republicans. In fact, the Federalists, the last time the Federalists pretty much end right here. In our nation's history, the Federalist Party only had 2 presidents, George Washington and John Adams. After that, the Republicans more or less take control, and by 1816, the Federalist Party is essentially no more. Section 5, Native American power and the United States. So let us recall that in an earlier chapter, we used this term middle ground. And the middle ground was a description of the area between Native American tribes and various European powers that no one single power had full control over. But as time went on, as the Dutch were kicked out, as the French were kicked out, as various Native Americans were, defeated on the battlefield, the middle ground gave way to a much less sophisticated diplomacy. And by the time we get to, about the American Revolution, essentially what we can think about in terms of diplomacy is that, especially after the American Revolution, is that we have, Native Americans on the one hand, we have the British, which are in Canada, we have the United States, and then very bottom, we have Spain and Florida. And so even though this middle ground, which had more participants during the colonial era, at least up until the American Revolution, there was still an ability for Native Americans to, quote unquote, play off some of the other powers in the region. And that is to leverage, diplomacy with the British, diplomacy with the United States, and diplomacy with Spain, and to use that, for their benefit. So we'll say about the playoff system, the ability for Native Americans to, quote unquote, play off the powers in the Americas. Now, of course, depending on one's location, this could work well, when you have the ability to travel, between, let's say, the Canadian and U.S. border or the Florida and U.S. border. So it works better in those circumstances. But as time goes on, increasingly Native Americans, especially those that are within the jurisdiction of the United States, are going to only have really one partner to deal with. And that puts Native Americans in a less advantageous position, especially considered when diplomacy is considered. Now, the United States, when it did become a brand new country, when it did enact a U.S. Constitution, more or less looked at Native Americans as being separate and sovereign, meaning that Native Americans were just like the British, they were just like French, they were not considered American, and it would require diplomacy and treaties and agreements in much the same way that one might deal with a foreign country. An example of Native American diplomacy is Red Jacket. Red Jacket, he was a Seneca war chief, and he worked as a sort of, we'll call him a middleman, early U.S./Native American diplomat. And for the most part, peace was sought after. That was the most desirable outcome. Native Americans could benefit the United States as being valuable trading partners, as passing along information. Similarly, the United States could benefit Native Americans by, providing certain goods, manufactured goods and stuff like that. So, peace was preferable, but that didn't mean that peace was always the outcome or conclusion. And we'll talk about specifically some violent confrontations that happened between Native Americans and the British and Native Americans in the United States in the early Republic period. Despite the fact that the U.S. government sought out things like treaties, diplomacy, trade, for the most part, the broader American population did not look upon Native Americans too highly. In fact, we can characterize the attitude that many white Americans had towards Native Americans as believing they were quote unquote ignorant savages. So this was the attitude white Americans held of Native Americans. And one important thing to take note of as far as U.S. Native American relations are concerned is that it's growing out of an earlier pre-revolutionary period between British Native American relations. And you might recall some of the stuff that we talked about from an earlier chapter, specifically around the time of the American Revolution. And this was the point where, you had, Native Americans. And, speaking about this, or actually, we'll go up here. This will make things a little bit easier. This is happening around the time of the 7 Years' War. And you'll recall that in the 7 Years' War, this playoff system was a little bit more advantageous for Native Americans because there was one other participant, and that was France. And, France being a global power, Native Americans could use the French to counterbalance British power. But after the 7 Years' War, the French were kicked out. And now dealing exclusively with a British, colonial blueprint. Remember, the British were interested in land. The French weren't interested too much. The British were interested in land. The French were not as interested in land. And so this sparked off violence following the 7 Years' War and the exit of France, more or less, from North America. And this coalesced itself around a conflict known as Pontiac's War and viewpoints about how Native Americans ought to face the challenge of white settlements in the American West coalesced around Neolin. Neolin was a Native American prophet. And again, he's around the 7 Years' War. So we've gone back a little bit before the Revolutionary era, right? This is during the 7 Years' War, before the Revolution, when the French are kicked out. Now the British are in. We'll say Native American prophet. We'll just say during 7 Years' War to avoid confusion. Who called on Native Americans to cut dependency on Europeans and use violence against the British. And this message inspired Pontiac, who led a revolt against British power, 1763 to 1765. So Pontiac's War, this was called a Native American uprising against the British. And the violence from Pontiac's War was eventually what resulted in the British passing that law called the Proclamation Line. The Proclamation Line was one of the grievances that the colonists had against the British Empire because it limited colonial settlement. That line essentially had divided British settlers from Native American lands, and at the very least had set aside land for Native Americans. It was designed to keep settlers back, and that was more or less a way for the British to try to regulate the violence, or try to cut down on some of the violence on the frontier. The point that your textbook makes about Neil Lynn and Pontiac's War is that the memory of these events, the message of Neil Lynn to call upon people to cut dependency from European goods, to use violence against encroaching settlement, those ideas are going to inspire later actions and later behaviors. So, for example, 30 years later, after Neil Lynn and after the Pontiac's War, you once again have a group of Native Americans that are confronted with similar issues. This time it's the Western Confederacy. This is a confederacy of Native Americans now facing, we might say Confederacy, or I guess we already have Confederacy in the title. We'll just say Native Americans. Now facing U.S. settlements, right? Because recall that while the British were willing to set up a line and divide Native American land from settler land, when the United States was victorious in the American Revolution, the Proclamation Line was gotten rid of. So now settlement into the Western Territory was even more. And after the American Revolution, the British had given that Western land to the Americans. And so the conflict that broke out between the Western Confederacy and Native America, the Western Confederacy and the United States here, this was a war in order to secure that land, because the reality was that, yes, the British had owned the land or controlled the land, but really in terms of who occupied it and who used it, well, that would have been Native Americans. So Native Americans facing U.S. settlement, we'll say go to war with the U.S. to preserve land. So it's a very similar circumstance to what happened 30 years earlier. The only difference here is that in 1763 it was against the British. Here it was, against the United States, and this war goes from 1791 to 1794. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, though, the United States is victorious, and this is essentially the battle that helped secure the what's called the Northwest Territory. So this is, we'll say, the defeat of the Western Confederacy. And say, and the securing of Western lands by the U.S. for settlement. Now, the defeat of the Western Confederacy in the 1790s, earlier prophets like Neil Lynn, eventually will inspire Tecumseh, who leads probably the most recognizable Native American uprising, maybe in all of American history. Tecumseh was actually at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He was a participant in that battle, and so that had resonated with him. And in order to face U.S. expansion, Tecumseh realized that it would require a much more coordinated effort, that he would have to call upon Native Americans from all over North America in order to put up a strong resistance against the United States. So Tecumseh, he traveled throughout the U.S., building a larger, more effective I will say confederacy to fight the United States. While Tecumseh was more involved in the alliance making, in the diplomacy, in building up forces, the military, the prophet Tenskenwadawa was more concerned with mobilizing people spiritually. He served a very similar purpose to what Nealon had served during Pontiac's War, and that is he preached a message to halt U.S. expansion and mobilized Native Americans against the U.S. So Tecumseh and Tenskenwadawa worked together, for this similar or common goal. But the process of confederation building could be quite difficult. In fact, let's just make this note here. This was similar to Nealon, right? And Nealon's message 40 years earlier. But the process of confederation building is quite difficult, especially Tecumseh looking to build a geographically larger, alliance. He visited areas like the Southeast to tribes like the Creek to invite them to be part of his confederation, to be part of his alliance. He did have some success. The Red Stick Creeks did agree, or we'll call the Red Stick Creeks. This was a southeastern tribe who agreed to join Tecumseh's confederation. But resistance against U.S. occupation or U.S. settlement hit a snag. As far as the Red Stick Creeks were concerned, they were engaged in a civil war in the Southeast, and this would ultimately result in the Red Stick Creeks losing that war. Creek Civil War, we'll say the Red Sticks lost to the Lower Creek Cherokee and an American general, Andrew Jackson. The result was that the Red Sticks lost land, and we can also say this weakened Tecumseh's alliance. More bad news for Tecumseh arrived at the Battle of Tippecanoe, in which Native Americans were defeated by U.S. forces. I don't know if your textbook mentions this, but Tenskenwadawa was at the battle. So that further dealt another significant blow to Tecumseh's project. But Tecumseh found an opportunity in the War of 1812. Now, we'll talk about this war here in a moment, but this is a war between the U.S. and the British. And the opportunity was that with the United States at war with the British, this made the United States look vulnerable. It also made the British a potential ally or a potential partner to resist American settlement. So in the War of 1812, Tecumseh, they attacked the U.S. Got support from Britain, but Tecumseh was killed in battle in 1813 during the war, and his resistance ended. So just to summarize, this section goes over three separate violent conflicts, but touches upon the similarities that are between all of them, specifically the message of Native American resistance and the effort for Native Americans to unify. But again, just to put things a little bit more clearly here, there's Pontiac's War. That is 1763 to 1765. That is versus the British. There's the war with the Western Confederacy. That is 1791 to 1794. This is now versus the United States. And the last one is Tecumseh's War, which is roughly 1810 to 1813. Again, the War of 1812 is going on in the backdrop. That is versus the United States with British support. So the three conflicts covered in this section: Pontiac's War, Western Confederacy, and Tecumseh's War. All right, the last section, section 6, the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is the culmination of the deteriorating relationship between Great Britain and the United States. This is the first declared war in American history. And it is between the United States versus Great Britain. It is essentially the American Revolution, Part 2. And there are several contributing factors. Some of these things will, should strike us as familiar because they were part of the tension between the U.S. and the British. The first one is impressment. And, at this point, hopefully, you know what impressment is, but in case we don't, again, this is the kidnapping of U.S. sailors and effectively forcing them to serve in the British Navy. This was a practice that the British had done to the colonists, and even when the United States declared independence, the British continued to do this. Most notably was the incident involving the USS Chesapeake, which was what we might call an impressment gone wrong, where the British had killed a number of Americans. And even then, during Jefferson's presidency, people demanded war with Britain, but Jefferson held them off. But this had been certainly, becoming more and more of an issue as, there was no solution. So USS Chesapeake, that was one example of impressment gone wrong, a bloody instance of impressment. The second reason that we can point to is that the British halted U.S. trade, specifically with France. Right? And recall that this kind of all has to do with the larger conflict of the French Revolutionary Wars. Right, 1789 to 1815, essentially, where France was fighting pretty much everyone, but Namely, they were fighting the British. And we talked about in earlier chapters how Washington maintained neutrality, but then John Adams got into a quasi-war with, with France. So this is the culmination of the United States trying to walk that tightrope of not joining the British, not joining the French. By the time you get to the year 1812, the United States is completely unable to maintain neutrality and finds themselves in an all-out declared war against the British. So the fact that the British were halting U.S. trade to France, that was another problem that the Americans had with the British. And lastly, the British support of Native American uprisings, Native American revolt. And last section, specifically, we mean Tecumseh. And you can see this point illustrated in this image here. You have Native Americans who are scalping a U.S. soldier and then giving that to a British official. And that's kind of one thing also to keep in mind about the War of 1812 is that, yes, we do talk about the War of 1812 as being a war between the United States and Britain. That's certainly true. But we probably can better understand it as a war against Britain and Native Americans. In fact, in terms of the activity, like, where is active fighting taking place, it's probably more active against Native Americans, to be perfectly honest. That might be a better way of rephrasing that. And that's kind of the role that Tecumseh plays in the overall picture. Now, for all these problems, the practice of impressment, British halted trade with the U.S., wouldn't let them trade with France, British supported Native American uprisings. James Madison, who was the president at the time, the successor of Thomas Jefferson, was still trying to maintain what Washington had set out, and that was neutrality. But there was a younger generation of American politicians that were pushing very aggressively towards war, and we call these the War Hawks. And the War Hawks are a younger generation of leaders pushing for war. All right, they're members in Congress, they're in the Senate. And, we have to recall that by the time we get to the year 1812, some of those who were part of the revolutionary movement, they've passed away. They're no longer there to provide leadership. George Washington is dead. Benjamin Franklin is dead. Alexander Hamilton is dead. And so the question is, well, who is going to lead the nation? And, these war hawks, they were too young to remember the horrors of the Revolutionary War. And so they were much more eager to push for it. Among the war hawks, the two ones that we will become more familiar with in the successive chapters, one is Henry Clay, and the other is John C. Calhoun. And Clay and Calhoun will become very important politicians from this period, more or less up into the Civil War. They emerge from the War of 1812 as this new generation of leadership, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. Now, as far as the war is concerned, the War of 1812 was a conflict that did not really see too much action on the battlefield, and that was mostly because at the time, say when the U.S. declared war, the British were still fighting Napoleon. All right, Napoleon. We're still fighting Napoleon in Europe. Napoleon. And so the British really didn't respond all that dramatically when the Americans declared war. One of the reasons why the United States declared war was because the British were seen as vulnerable, because they were engaged with a much larger army that they had to contend with. And the Americans had hoped that perhaps they were able to annex Canada in the process. And so as far as the actual fighting is concerned, the War of 1812 opens up with a failed U.S. invasion of Canada. Say the U.S. fails in their attack on Canada. And after that, invasion fails, for the most part, activity between the United States and the British is pretty, there's not really a lot going on. And, here's the point where we can make the argument, say, where there wasn't really too much fighting going on between Britain and the United States. It was from, 1812, 1813, 1814, 1815, that there was more activity going on, between the U.S. and, various groups of Native Americans in the West, and also Tecumseh. Now, as far as the War of 1812 is concerned, it's a war in which does not have a clear outcome. That is to say, it's difficult to determine a victor and a loser, and it's really not consequential in terms of like changing territory, or not really a lot comes from it in that respect. And so sometimes, this is kind of silly, but sometimes it's said that the outcome of the war was a tie, right? That neither side really won. Like if war was some sort of game, it was a sort of a tie score at the end. But there were some significant consequences from it, right? And we'll talk about some of those here. One, and this is kind of a fun fact, is that the War of 1812 gave us the lyrics to the U.S. national anthem, that is the Star-Spangled Banner. We'll say the lyrics of the national anthem, is the Star-Spangled Banner, were written at the Battle of Baltimore by Francis Scott Key. Again, just kind of a fun fact. From the War of 1812, we get the lyrics to our national anthem. When the British finally defeated Napoleon, which they did, they could then focus their efforts on the United States, and they decided that they would attack the nation's capital, which was Washington, D.C. We might mention that upon the surrender of Napoleon in Europe, the British attacked and burned down Washington, D.C., which was the nation's capital. And we can see an image here of British forces burning down the city. It doesn't look good, when you're on the side of the Americans and, the enemy burns down your capital. But, to be, perfectly, frank, Washington, D.C. wasn't really an important city besides that. It wasn't like Philadelphia or New York or even Baltimore for that matter. But the British did successfully burn down the White House during the War of 1812. The fighting at this point more or less had come to a halt. And in fact, there had already been negotiations wanting to bring an end to this conflict. And when it did finally come to an end, again, there wasn't really all that much consequential. But there's a couple other additional things that come out of the War of 1812. And there's going to be two things that I would say are important consequences to remember, right? You're going to want to know these ones. The first one is that the War of 1812 provided a new generation of leaders, right? So we'll say the War of 1812 gave the U.S., we'll say a new generation of leaders. Again, there's a lot of anxiety considering that the Washingtons, the Franklins, the Hamiltons had passed. Would this experiment continue to work? Who is going to answer the call? And, the War of 1812 provided an answer. In some respects, it was Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun who, at the conclusion of the War of 1812, despite the fact of being a tie, Americans claimed victory. And people like Clay and Calhoun, they were proven right. They said, look, we were right to call for war against the British. We're claiming victory. We're claiming we won. And so that allowed them to build, political careers. But perhaps the most significant person to, really have their celebrity profile raised as a result of the War of 1812 was Andrew Jackson, who took on a persona that was akin to George Washington. He became a war hero, and it was mainly his action at the Battle of New Orleans that made him, pretty much the most popular figure in the United States overnight. So, the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson will say that Jackson led U.S. forces to victory over the British, making him a war hero. And Jackson's going to have a very similar trajectory to George Washington, going from general to eventually president, right? And it's the Battle of New Orleans and Jackson's victory over the British that is going to allow him to, to pave the way for a political career. So Jackson, again, his role in the War of 1812, again, provides him for being a new leader for the United States. The second major consequence is the political consequence, and that is the effect that the War of 1812 has on the on the party system. Now, I don't know if we've actually used this term before, but I'm going to go ahead and outline it here, and that is something called the first party system. Now, when you have a political system set up like ours in the United States, where it's winner takes all, political parties were more or less coalesce around two groups. And in various points in American history, those two political parties have had different have been different, right? Different names. The first party system, the first two political parties were the Federalists and Republicans. And what the War of 1812 does is that it brings an end to this first party system by more or less making the Federalist Party extinct. And what was responsible, or largely responsible, for the Federalist Party going extinct was the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention was a meeting of Federalists to essentially denounce the war. We'll just say to oppose the war and call on new constitutional amendments. And it was even rumored that the Federalists were talking about secession, or to secede. That is, if the Federalists didn't get their way, perhaps that they were going to break away. And so you can imagine this in the context of the country at the time, which is most Americans are celebrating victory over the British. Again, from a standpoint today, again, it's not clear that the Americans won, but the Americans certainly acted like they won. They're celebrating heroes like Andrew Jackson. There's a sense of unity. There's as we'll talk about here in a second, there's an era of good feelings. There's a sense of renewed nationalism. And the Federalists are coming out and saying, look, we're actually opposed to the war. We don't really like the way the government is going. We might even break away if it goes that far. And recall that the Federalists, and this put the Federalists in a difficult position. The Federalists had always favored the British side. And so while the United States was at war with Great Britain, there were people that looked at the Federalists with a little bit of suspicion, right? How much do you want the British to actually win? Talk about secession, talk about constitutional amendments. To make a long story short, the second major consequence came out of this, and that was the Federalists were labeled traitors. And as traitors, they never recovered. And in 1816, the last Federalist president ran for election, and after that, the Federalist Party becomes extinct. So when we look at the War of 1812 and say, yeah, nothing really happened, it was a tie, nothing big, that's true. But domestically inside the United States, there were some pretty important consequences, right? This gave us our new leadership. It ended the first party system. We'll talk more about how politics evolves from this point onwards. And, maybe three, it contributed to an era of good feelings, and this was a sense of national unity. All right, remember that the biggest division in the country in earlier decades was this first party system. In fact, George Washington was even worried that the country could possibly come to an end because the political parties were fighting. But this new sense of victory is, it's victory in war and one party rule. I mean, that's what we mean by an era of good feelings. There's only one political party, right? What do we have to worry about, right? It seemed like the country was united. Now we're going to learn in the next couple of chapters, the country really isn't as united as it seems at the time. Pharaoh's party is dead, one party rule, victory over the British. This is a time to feel good about. And the era of good feelings manifested itself in different ways. It manifested itself economically. Henry Clay became the largest proponent of what was called the American system. And this was the desire to invest and build the US economy, right? To make it independent from Britain. So we use this term American system really to describe just any type of internal investment, right? If you want to make the American economy strong, it would say that you are contributing to the American system. And so things that fall under the American system, things like banks, specifically national banks, tariffs, things like road construction, railroads. And, there was a pretty strong sentiment that Americans were like, yeah, we should cut our economic dependence off Britain and we should invest more in our own country and make the American economy strong and independent from the rest of the world. It also manifested itself in terms of foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine also in some ways reflected this era of good feelings. The Monroe Doctrine was when the U.S. proclaimed the Western Hemisphere, right, so the Americas, free from, say, European, say, colonization. And this was a way for the United States in some ways to kind of puff up its chest over at Europe and say, look, this is our side of the world, North and South America. You Europeans stay out, right? So the Monroe Doctrine was an effort to try to keep Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. And in some sense, this was kind of like a symbol of unity between North America and South America at the time. We don't really go into a lot of detail, but Latin America had gone through similar revolutions. Instead of breaking away from Britain, they broke away from Spain and they created democratic and republican governments. And so, the War of 1812 and this new sense of nationalism had Americans being a little bit more confrontational than they were in the past. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is a good sentiment. The United States claimed that Europe was to stay out, or that, and this is a sentiment that is expressed later on in American history, that the Americas are kind of like our backyard, stay away, Europe. But at the time, the United States really wasn't, strong enough to enforce this in any way, right? It wasn't ready to take on, Europe. But again, when we think about as we progress 1815, that becomes, the end of the War of 1812. It's a year in which there is strong national unity. Something very different is going to happen as we progress to 1860. So we might think of the end of this chapter, 1815, as being, maybe the height of national unity, good feelings, and it going more or less downhill from there.